My name is David Cloete. I was born and raised in the Northern Cape of South Africa province. Moved to Cape Town, furthered my studies at CPUT Cape Town campus. While there, not really while there, but while in Cape Town, I got introduced to the gospel in a much more deeper and meaningful way. Got saved. The Lord really opened my eyes to the beauty of the gospel. Got introduced to sound teaching by a lot of good African and also white Christian brothers. Came alongside me in that way, and here I am today. But I am in full-time ministry actually as a result of seeing what the Lord has done through their ministry and through student ministry. It actually pulled me into student ministry, and so I serve on a campus as well, doing Christian ministry among students.
No, that's good. Thanks for the introduction, David. You maybe just as we're talking about that, share a bit more on your work as far as reaching out to students with regards to this topic. So, what level of inferiority would you say you experience on a regular basis? Particularly, it could be at church or maybe even on campus, as you train young Christians, and what could the trigger of this type of introspection that you probably have to go through be brought about?
Sure. So obviously, there's as a person of color. First of all, I identify as colored. I am colored culturally, and I think. So there's personal experiences, but there's also experiences that I've had with young adult students and their encounters with what does it mean to be black in a South African context, a society that has been racialized, so heavily racialized, that can hardly think outside of those categories. Sure. So I would probably start with, in terms of personal encounters. I realized very soon that I was colored. I think there's a becoming in the sense that you know because of certain events in your life that you realize that you are black or that you're a person of color. Our parents do a very great job, phenomenal job. They raise us in shacks, they raise us in poverty in many ways, but we don't feel black. Funny enough, in our context, we don't feel black. It's when we get out of those contexts, when we come to a campus, university campus, and we can't pay fees. And that was my story. You can't pay fees. And this is 2007, before we had Fees Must Fall, before we had the Must Fall movement. You can't pay fees. You're looking for accommodation. You don't have a laptop. You don't have something to work on. You stay extra hours. Sometimes you leave 12 o'clock the evening. You sleep over at e-learning. You do all those things happen, but then you look at your fellow students, white students in particular. They drive into campus. And then you start to realize, hey, there's something here about my experience that's totally different from other people's experience. Why is that? And then you start to dig deeper. And a lot of students that I've encountered, actually, they discover their blackness during such incidences. And they start to question, why is the world the way they are, even though they're born free? They begin to engage with their lives, begin to understand why they are the way, why the world works the way they work. I remember one incident in terms of inferiority. Students said to me, they worked in a small group doing group assignments, and there were white students as well in the group, and as they were engaging during this time discussing this assignment, one of the things that some of these white students were woke, and they were saying, you got to be careful. They said to this other student of color, you got to be careful because we typically, many white students look down on our white lecturers or black lecturers because we think they're incompetent. We don't think they can deliver as good as all the white lecturers does. And that student then said to me, you know what I do, David? Every time I enter a class, I make it my job to make that lecturer feel affirmed. Because I understand what that means, what that feels like. Because I, for many years, felt like our faculty is one of the best faculties on campus because we had white lecturers, we had white administrators, and it's just better because they are there. Whenever we are involved in something, we are like this. That's how I used to feel until I asked myself, why do I feel this way? Why do I think of my world in this way? And I realized there's messages that's constantly sent my way that makes me feel this way. Whether it's government not helping our community's infrastructure, whether it's you're going to the public squares, you read history, the one-sidedness of history, all those messages reinforce a kind of narrative about the place of Black people and how Black people are supposed to think of themselves, people of color are supposed to think of themselves, and how they appropriate their world. I remember one time when I went to a job interview, I got the job because the guy told me because I'm colored, and he doesn't. And as a colored guy, he said to me, "You got the job because you colored, in a sense, because you know how those other guys think." And I was like, "What do you mean? How do other people think?" It's like, yeah, but you know how they are. And so there's a level of, and I know this is a very touchy subject. There's a level of colored privilege that we have as colored people. I'm thinking about the Cape Flats. When you think of Cape Flats in Cape Town, people think about the area where colored people stay. Meanwhile, the flats that's not the definition. It's not because of the buildings, the flats that's there. It's actually because the area, the region is the flatlands. And so if you think Cape Flats, you're supposed to think Khayelitsha, you're supposed to think Mitchell's Plain, you're supposed to encompass that whole area. But because the flats are so associated with the Cape Flats, and our houses are a bit different than the shacks, than what Black people stay in, that has also reinforced a lot of our thinking about colored people and thinking about themselves as better as Black people. And so when we enter into those spaces, when we enter in conversations, hashtag Colored Lives Matter. And then immediately there's a debate currently in the country happening. Black people saying, "But you guys are Black," yes. And we can go into all of that stuff, but sticking on the topic. So some of that thinking, there's a level of, I think, there's a level of inferiority, superiority, that's also within the Black community in the South African context, that's there in the way that we think we are a little bit better than Black because we're not entirely Black because of the privileges that we got during apartheid and the way we think of ourselves as a people and as a people group. And so there's a lot of that going on as well in the conversation.
Sure, there's a lot that you said in there, and I think it's quite interesting how, like, the way you started off, like we're very racialized. And on the topic of privilege, I think it's quite interesting because with regards to Black middle class in a context of the new elites, what Triple BE has done is it has given people like myself who live in the city a level of I ought to think of myself more highly than I should be in compared to my other Black brothers in the townships who didn't get to where I am supposedly because of hard work. So there's a lot of messages being sent. I mean, you're seeing things like cliques recently of just reinforcing this type of thing. So how, in your opinion, I know you've been in spaces and are still in spaces, particularly in the church, where the church is predominantly white congregation. How can, in your opinion, how can we challenge this problem of inferiority complex within that space?
Yeah, so I think this conversation comes down to the issue of dignity, and if we're gonna speak to the man, I think we need to speak about Black dignity, and I put Black in quotes. I think there's a conversation that we have to have in terms of dignity, and because the conversation has always been around race, the church in particular on being intentional about discipling young adult Black people on how to think gospelly about their world. We often think politically about it, and we often think about race when we think about this. And so that has sort of made the church not to speak about the issue. Another issue is within the church that has caused the church not to address this issue around the issue of dignity, because I think if we do that, then we get into really image of God stuff. What gives value to a human being? How God thinks of us, how we ought to think about ourselves as people created in His image, but then also as people being redeemed and being created in the image of Christ. So I think the conversation is there, but because so many of our pastors has also been told that, if you get into these conversations, that's political, that's moving away from the gospel, that's not really centering Jesus. You can have all of those things, how people think about, assigning to the church a different mission altogether, because we're supposed to focus on the kingdom and getting people into heaven and getting people saved. I think those things distract. So I think if we can reorientate our theology in terms of thinking about when Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, therefore go and make disciples. We start with go and make disciples of all nations. You're not supposed to start there. You're supposed to start with, okay, the disciples, when they met Jesus, some of them doubted and some believed. Matthew 28, some of them doubted and some believed. And so from that onwards, you start working with, okay, on what level do I engage with the person, the Christian? Is it an unbeliever, or is the believer who still has doubts about, this Jesus person? And that's where our discipleship needs to start. And then secondly, if the person is full on with Jesus, then you get into the, all things in creation belongs to Him and they must submit to Jesus. And so a holistic gospel is the first thing I'd say you need. An understanding of Jesus as Lord of heaven and earth. And as a result of that, His gospel, His life, the life that He gives, the salvation life, needs to permeate through every area of my life. So that's the first thing. It's theology. We need to get our theology right. Get a holistic understanding of the gospel. Second thing I think we need to do is center the conversation around dignity. And by dignity, I mean, then we get to ask questions of, how do we think of ourselves ethnically, and how being a Christian first informs my ethnic identity within a racialized society like South Africa. How are we to think about ourselves? Discipleship, we have to do that work. And so when you get into issues of dignity, then you get into issues of when things like fees must fall happen. Then the church doesn't sit with the problem of because we were not involved in that movement. The students didn't feel the need to come to us because they thought, or they saw the Christian faith as either complicit with apartheid and colonialism, or they saw the Christian faith as spiritual. It's got nothing to say about this stuff, and so we're gonna stay clear of this stuff. So when we get into the idea of Black dignity and reshaping that understanding of how people are supposed to think about themselves, then we get into practical issues, concrete issues of alleviating poverty and speaking to the issues of poverty. Then the church started rolling out not just theoretical and theological ideas, but practical things that helps people of color within the church community to think differently. So some of the practical things that I'd say is, one of the things that I implemented when I was in the township church was have people within the church to adopt a young adult, especially those who are particularly on the margins, those who you can just see when they enter the church, their clothing is not well, they don't dress very well, they when I don't say don't dress very well, it's just because this family is poor, and so they don't have a lot. And so adopt those kids, adopt families, reach your families within the community, adopt families. And when I say adopt, you don't say, oh, I'm adopting that family, I'm taking care of that family. It means being intentional about seeing who has need and then saying, okay, I am going to help such and such's family with getting their school fees in order. We're in the township, and I know the tithes can't even pay pastor's salary. But I know that when I leave church here, I'm going to go to Waterfront, or I'm going to go to some luxury place, and I'm going to blow easily 1,000 rand on something that I may not really have needed. That's a young person's fees for maybe registration, that you can say, okay, I'm going to help such and such family with that because they're in the family of faith first. We're going to adopt a police station and see how we can work within the community to show difference and make a difference within the community. In that sense, be a go-between. So being involved in the community and being involved from a church level locally amongst ourselves, I think implementing various things with schools, adopting a school and running aftercare programs, and then with that going in with a gospel image of God understanding. And framework to help kids to think about themselves and their world in that way. And I think those kind of intentionality, those kind of works, things are not being done. And as a consequence, the youth don't see the church as relevant. The youth don't see this area as relevant, or they don't understand when bad things happen, like racism happens, why there's so much trauma and they act the way they act. Meanwhile, they never lived under apartheid. Why do I have this pent up anger? And I don't understand where it comes from. So I think it's getting our theology right, and then from there thinking about dignity and thinking holistically about dignity and running programs that assist the church to answer some of the tough questions related to what gives dignity. Is there food in the house? Is there food in my stomach when I go to study? What kind of financial assistance and other assistance are we lending and providing towards families to help themselves get out?
No, that's good. That's good.
I hope it makes sense.
David, thanks for that. Yeah, no, it does. So I think what I'm hearing is, adopting a holistic understanding of God will lead us to, solving all these problems, and being more involved in the community within the people in the margins. So I think that's a big thing, because again, you spoke about dignity, which is in itself, entrenched in who you are. And I think, other inferiority complex in the faith, from Black and colored young Christians, represented, and particularly some of them who are listening to this might have recently started working. The biggest issue is representation, and I think it's one of the things when you look at Christianity in history, is people who look like me and you are not necessarily in taught about in churches. So when we quote around, God working in people's lives, we don't quote people who look like me and you, David. So how do we then, in context of discipleship, how are you, so first you could tell us a bit, how are you doing this on the campus with, I know you told me the university you're in predominantly training Black students. So in the context of that, how are you, or how can we be involved in changing this narrative of representation in the faith, so that the next generation does not feel like this faith doesn't belong to them because they're not represented? And again, reinforcing the same issue of missing the dignity conversation.
Sure. So I guess it is, as you say, it is starting with being intentional about quoting Black authors and Christian authors and directing people towards those resources written by Black Christians. But of course, also walking that journey with them, so that they don't get overwhelmed by some of the things that are being said there. But I think there's another level of this conversation, in that, I mean, you look at the polls. Young people don't vote. They're not really interested in politics from a structural level in the in the bigger scheme of things. And so when you think of policy, we don't really know what DAEFF and those people stand for. And besides politics, South African politics, I'm talking about the politics in terms of how society is structured. I don't think there's as much an invested interest by young people today to see how we can make the city flourish gospelly, intentionally, in terms of how society is ordered. And so one of the things that I encounter when I do Bible studies with with young adults, and I bring up some of the stuff. Some of the guys are like, "How did you know I was going through this, David? Are you prophetic? Are you?" And I'm like, first of all, no, I'm not a prophet. I'm black. I'm a person of color. So here's what the guys, their minds get blown, because how did I know they after this they have black text? How did I know all of this, and this? Because when we're in church, this stuff doesn't come out. This Christianity is something else. And some of them fight. Some of the students will even fight you for bringing up, the race conversation through scripture. So when you read the Samaritan woman, I say to my colored students, this woman was colored. She was half Jew and she was half Gentile. And Jesus is having a conversation, and Jesus is saying, hey, and she was a woman who was ousted by a community. So the layers of who this woman is all in that section. And I try to bring that out and say, you see how Jesus confronts her culture, how Jesus confronts her religion, how Jesus confronts her whole world in the way she thinks of herself. And I want you to bring you into the story and see yourself in the story. And then I make illustrations like, there's a thing amongst colored people about when we talk about kham. I don't know if you've heard this expression before. Kham is what so-called civil coloreds call uncivil coloreds. Coloreds who are not, they're not there. They're not socially, economically, if whatever you want to call it, they're not the ideal color. They're the poor coloreds. They're the outsider coloreds. We call them kham. If you investigate the term, that word is spelled G-H-A-M. You know where that comes from? It comes from the doctrine of Ham. If you go back to Genesis 9, if you know the whole story of Ham, its origins is from there.
That's big, David. No, really, really appreciate a lot of that. But David, maybe just in closing, you could share a word of, what you just said was in the sense a word of encouragement, but maybe a word of encouragement in short for someone who definitely is. I know I have to reinforce and reaffirm my identity in God, because society doesn't do that so much. So what is your biggest encouragement to someone who is battling with the identity, not so much that they don't know who God is, but they do know him, but they don't really they're struggling to come to grip with how we might have received Christianity and all of the in-betweens of history that has distorted the reality of who God is. What would you say as an encouragement for them to even keep on looking, keep on seeking God in that faith?
Sure. I'd say to you, do not, first of all, if you're in a space where you go like, sure, when I look at history and I look at the church's involvement, I'm on the verge of walking away from this thing called Christianity. I want to say to you, the first thing I want to say to you, do not count things to Jesus that you need to count to man. Jesus is not man, and man will disappoint you. I see a lot of guys leave churches and they bash churches because a pastor has failed in some area way, and they walk away from the faith as if Jesus has failed them. The same thing with colonialism and apartheid. Men have distorted the gospel, and the gospel was as much, the Bible was as much a victim as you and I were as people of color, because of people's poor theology. So do not count to the gospel and the Bible, God's inerrant, infallible, authoritative, beautiful word, life-speaking, dignity-giving word. Do not ever distort that message for what people has done. Be critical about people, assess people according to God's standards, and you will see that God comes out the victor. And we will always be shown for what we truly are, hypocritical sinners. And maybe you'll find yourself in that batch. And then you come and say, Lord, I need you as much as that sinner needed you. And I'm committed to your kingdom, and I want to see your kingdom come and not my kingdom come. Your Jesus come and not my idea of Jesus. That's the first thing. The second thing I do is, if you're not in that space, you're in this conversation and you're like, man, I've heavily invested in this stuff and people are calling me all kinds of names. I'm a cultural Marxist. I'm a guy who left the gospel because I speak about justice. Hey, I'm there. I'm your guy. People will call you all kinds of things. But Jesus says they persecuted in Matthew's gospel, they persecuted the prophets for these things. If you're going to be a prophetic voice, this is your package. This is what's going to come your way. But for heaven's sake, do not ever try to think that you're going to solve this by yourself and do this by yourself. If you're talking about dignity, if you want to preserve your energy, choose your battles. Choose your battles. Don't give up on the conversation. Be a prophetic voice, be a prophetic witness and a gospel witness, but also protect your mental health. Be with Christians and among Christians who understand you, where you don't have to defend or explain your blackness, who understand that God values you because he made you this way and he loves you just the way you are. Gravitate towards people like that. Not necessarily politically, because then you'll only hear people who will say things to what your itchy ears would hear. I'm talking about gospel-centered people who will challenge you on your skew theology, on your only speaking about justice stuff, because you need to hear that stuff. Let them challenge you, but also people who you don't have to explain a lot of stuff, where you can be affirmed, where you can get fresh oil, where you can be like pushed a little bit and say, you're not alone in this. You're not crazy when you talk about this. People may think you may feel that you're alone, but you're not alone in this. So that's what I say secondly. And then to the guys who just, want to be church, you're not into this stuff. You're not particularly, on the conversation as much as other people are. That's good. It's fine. If you're black and that's you, that's fine, bro. You do you. But do know that we are a community of faith, and so love your brothers in their differences. Love your brothers in their. Listen, 90% of the students that I disciple are DA supporters, and they're all black. They are all black. They love DA. Okay.
My goodness.
and here's the beauty of it. So when the EFF students come into my Bible study, when the DA students come into my Bible study, here's what I do. I open the Bible and I say, what does Jesus have to say? And we discuss Jesus and we discuss the text, and then we ask questions about application. And so if you keep doing that work, you'll begin to see how flawed our theology is, how humanistic it is, in the sense that not worldly, but humanistic in the sense that how limited we are in our grappling with Scripture, and that actually maybe there's some areas that are missing that these guys are getting, and so I need to listen to these guys more. I need to listen to what they have to say, and I think if we can begin to think about our world in this way, in a way that I've been socialized in a particular way, I have particular experiences that this person doesn't have, and I need to be gracious because I don't understand, because I'm not coming from that place. But if you're from Ikasi and you fully understand the conversation, you need to be gracious to the other guy as well. The goal is to love Jesus and to honor Jesus and to meet him when he tells you, thank you for and well done, my good and faithful servant. That's what you want. That's the goal. Not win battles here. That's the goal. Be faithful to Jesus.